So let's start with direct indexing. I'm actually curious about that one.
Yes. Do you know what direct indexing is to start with?
Yeah. So I actually am a big believer of direct indexing. I in fact would go one step further and do direct indexing, and I call it adjusted direct indexing, meaning that I would pick the best companies of an index and just try to eliminate maybe 20% of the bad apples of an index. Some things are so obvious to any common person that potentially could make the indexing better. But direct indexing has I think there are many benefits here. One thing is specifically in a taxable account, if some of the elements of that index or some of the components of that index have fallen in value, you might be able to tax harvests much more efficiently than just owning the index, right? So if the index is up to 8%, there's companies that are up 50 and companies that are down 40. You might as well just sell off the 40 ones and maybe buy them a month and a half later, a month later, so you don't have it to fall into the wash sale rule. Wash sale rule, which is a tax rule that you should be aware of. I'm just going to say look it up because we're going to put it in the description. But it's it's not a good thing to fall under. And
yeah, so
anyway.
So direct indexing is its own little world at this point, and it is exploding in popularity right now. Because 2020 was an awesome year to be a direct indexer. Like, you couldn't have written up a better playbook for a year in which direct indexing would shine. So the first component of it is that it's very similar to just index investing.
Okay. I was going to say the first component of that was going to be like the commissions. It went to zero, and that makes it much more feasible to do direct indexing.
Definitely. So September 2019, is that when commissions at the big big four went to zero? It was something like that. Yeah, it was like Q3 of 19, I believe, when TD Ameritrade, Schwab, Fidelity, they all said, yeah, we're done with commissions. Yeah.
The story is quite interesting. I think it's like Interactive started it by offering like Interactive Lite, which is zero commissions, and then Schwab immediately like pounded and said, being the 800-pound gorilla in the room, they just said, we are doing away with commissions. And then TD is like, no, I have to follow.
Yes,
they followed, exactly. And then they just got sucked into Schwab after they realized that they're not going to make a lot of money.
Fidelity was like 8 weeks late. They like took their sweet time. Yeah, so direct indexing is at its core very similar to index investing. It is index investing. What you're trying to do is own the index, but instead of owning an index fund, a mutual fund, or an ETF, you own the entire index directly. So if you're direct indexing the S&P 500, you should have a brokerage account that owns 500 stocks in the same weighting that they are in the index, the S&P 500 index, which is published constantly, updated.
How often are the weights updated in an index?
Well, they're dynamic because they are. Well, it depends on the index. So there's kind of like more active indices that have rebalancing frequencies. In something market cap weighted, it's rebalanced constantly, right? Because on an instantaneous basis, the market cap weightings change.
But what about like the SPY? Is it consistently updating based on? I guess they have. The market weights, the relative market weights are always shifting. Are they always shifting their holdings as well? Or is there like a delay or do they do that once a quarter, for example?
They do it constantly in an ETF through the creation and redemption mechanism, which we can link to reading on how all that works. But yeah, it's meant to be constant. And one of the things that you'll see when you read about index funds is tracking error, which is the difference between what an ETF that's meant to replicate an index and the actual index returns do. So tracking error is exactly what you're talking about, that lag, right? If we miss a trade or get something.
So if the tracking error is very small, it means that they're closely resembling the index.
Exactly right. Which should be the case for a product like SPY, right? SPY should very, very closely replicate the
and it should be pretty easy because there's liquidity there, and that there are only 500 or 503 components.
So again, direct indexing is kind of this rejection of the idea that we need a fund to get this done, and saying, yeah, we can go replicate this index directly in a brokerage account, which leads to some interesting implications, especially if you have turnover. So turnover would mean buying and selling in the index, right? Changing the components, needing to rebalance, needing to sell a winner or sell a loser, or whatever it is. But what people have found through rigorous research is that you can very carefully tax manage a direct index to make it meaningfully tax beneficial to own a direct index rather than the whole index. And the real trade-off here is what we just talked about, which is tracking error. So in the example that you just gave earlier, where you've got some dispersion, maybe a big holding is up 10% and a smaller holding is down 15%. You can sell the one that's down 15%. What you're doing by doing that is you're giving up tracking error for better or for worse compared to the index, right? Because if you're not going to hold that loser that's down 15%, which is what the index would be doing, you're going to perform slightly differently. So upside, like the core upside, is that you can harvest tax losses more meaningfully, more consistently, more granularly. The trade-off is tracking error. You may not do exactly what the index is doing, which if you're a hardcore, pure index person and saying, yeah, I always want to do exactly what the S&P or what the total market is doing, you are not going to have that precisely. You can mitigate that, but you're not going to have it precisely.
In terms of how do you implement this if you're an individual investor?
This is a complicated thing to undergo because the number of trades is very high. The dynamism is very high, right? There's a lot going on to be tracking an index directly in a portfolio. So there's specialty providers who really do this in a separately managed account. It would be an insane undertaking for you as a non-quantitative, regular discretionary investor to say, yeah, I'm going to do my best to trade the whole S&P 500 and just rebalance it daily and implement smart algorithmic tax loss harvesting. That's another trade-off here. So a direct indexing provider will tout, yeah, you don't have to pay ETF costs or fund costs anymore, which is true, but ETF fund costs for a global portfolio, I think the ETF.com used to publish this, the world's simplest ETF portfolio was 5 basis points or 8 basis points, which is 0.05%, 0.08%. Very, very inexpensive to do that. For a direct index, I think that the least that you're going to pay is something like 25 or 30 basis points to a provider, an investment manager who's going to manage a direct index for you.
If essentially, I know, for example, Wealthfront has a direct indexing option for accounts that are $500,000 or larger. And I know there are tools out there for direct indexing. I personally like direct indexing, I think, but I would, again, always adjust it to eliminate the known bad apples of stocks. It's like, can you imagine if you had some index where you had BlackBerry or the old BlackBerry, not the new one? Because they've switched their businesses a lot, but there are companies out there that that are secular decline. And obviously efficient markets would price that in, but you just rather not own them. And so I think there are benefits for that, the ability of customization, as you mentioned before.
Agreed. And I think as it becomes more ubiquitous, it will come to be expected that investors have that level of customization in a portfolio. I think that's in the next 5 or 10 years that will be expected, that anyone would be able to do a socially responsible screen or an industry specific screen or blacklist 5 companies that they want to own.
An S&P 500 socially responsible, weighted, right? So eliminate all the the socially not responsible, or let's say you want majority or equal or majority representation in the boardroom, by some minority, or like minority represented in the boardroom by, according to the US population, like kind of that stuff. You'd be able to customize it. I think we talked about the changes that happened in the last 2 years. I think one of the important change that happened that really benefits the possibility of doing direct indexing is fractional shares, right? Because just buying one stock of Amazon will set you back at $3,200 right now, something like that, right? So direct indexing, the old way would be very costly, and with fractional shares that becomes a possibility.
Correct. There's a lot more layers. I could keep going on this topic for a long time. There's slippage costs of being a small trader and execution of not being able to execute trades as efficiently as a big ETF might. I also think that
on the same hand, you're now moving markets as like a big ETF is.
Sure, could be true. In addition to that, the higher the turnover your strategy, so the further you get away from an index and the further you get to something that has a decent amount of turnover, the better the ETF tax laws are. So the tax laws as they apply to an active ETF for equities, for example, are tremendously favorable, where you can functionally turn a positive trade inside an ETF that made a good trade for you into just an increased share price and not pass that capital gain through, which there's reading on that, and you could go check on how good ETFs are for that. I think as you get further to the active spectrum, the better that an active ETF kind of shines.
Oh, really? I know there's literature on how Vanguard reduces or eliminates taxes.
Yeah, that's a deep. You're way in the weeds there. Vanguard does this shifting thing where they do basis trades between their mutual funds and ETFs to manage tax liabilities as much as they can. That's a unique Vanguard thing. I don't think anyone else does that.
The next topic, what should we talk about next? Phoenix Suns? Do a little fun here.
Yeah, let's do
Raise
the
the
Suns,
spirits.
man. Yes,
of our listeners.
The Phoenix Suns. Gabe, let's start with this. What do you know about the Phoenix Suns this year in 2021?
Well, I mean, I know the Suns had a good year like in 1998 or something like that.
My brother-in-law told me he's born and raised in Phoenix, and he's like, every decade, man, once a decade, this just happens. It just is what it is. So yes, you're right. There was like a late 90s run. There was a like 2008, 2009 run, and now, roughly a decade later.
Didn't they? I think they won. That was like 2005 to 2008 or 7 or something, where like they were like on fire. It was like just
the Steve Nash, Amari Stoudemire era was a really good one. Yeah. So a boom and bust type of team, similar to Phoenix or Vegas real estate cycles. The Suns are
are they correlated? I think it was like because in 2008, I think they'd stopped winning.
Honestly, might be correlated with the Phoenix real estate market. And like how good the team owner is feeling about finances of whether he wants to pay for good players. So I can see that connection for sure.
Well, was there a recession in 1994? Because there was a gap there in their division title wins.
Really, honestly, could be. But yeah, look, man, we're putting Phoenix is back on the map. We're a globally critical city once again because our NBA team is good. Devin Booker is the hero of heroes. Also, he's a Mississippi guy. Shout out Mississippi. So I extra triple love him for that. Last night he played with a broken nose. Patrick Beverley, the evil Clippers troublemaker, most definitely broke Devin Booker's nose. An unlikely comeback, a bad call, win against the Suns in the last like 8 seconds. An awesome game, dude. If you're not watching NBA playoffs, even if you don't like basketball, just turn on the fourth quarter. I promise you'll get excited.
Their win-loss ratio has been incredible this year.
They've now won 9 playoff games in a row.
Yeah, that's just insane.
It is. There's a lot going right. A couple things going wrong too. Chris Paul is out for health and safety protocols, and no one's really reported on what exactly is going on. It seems to be COVID related, but he has also made comments to the media that he was vaccinated, maybe. So it's really, I'm not sure what the situation is there. But you would think that the NBA is very pro giving Chris Paul rope to come back, or, be as lenient with protocol as possible, because he's a huge star and this is the playoffs and they want to see their stars playing in the playoffs. So a little bit of a weird situation with that. But everything else is super awesome. And our number one overall pick from 3 years ago is playing his heart out, DeAndre Ayton. Shout out to him. He's having an unbelievable playoffs. So it's all very exciting as the Suns.
Next topic here, the possibility of no inflation. We all know that if you've gone to a supermarket lately or if you've ordered food online, you've seen dramatic price increases in food. Transportation is up, but that's natural, right? Tickets were like, $70 going back and forth to LA from New York. Now they're back to normal pricing. Statistically, that means that there's a lot of inflation, but in reality, that's just a resumption of normal times. I think also planes, they've had staffing issues. I've heard, or I've read that
American Airlines,
they had to cancel some flights, and they'll cancel some flights because they have staffing issues to maintain the operations of the airline.
My local Starbucks is not taking online orders because of shortages of stuff.
Staff, input,
I think it's product and staff, maybe.
Oatmeal, oat milk.
Oat milk. It could be oat milk. Yeah.
Oat milk. Yeah. So I mean, it's an interesting time we're living in. There's shortages of everything just because there are supply chain disruptions. I think that will normalize. I think when we normalize that aspect, I think also, give it or not, there's going to be a giant experiment going on, which is the reduction of the unemployment benefits, and we'll see that in a couple of states. I would say the Republican-leaning states, they will take that away from unemployed people to see if it makes the unemployed look for more jobs, which is, it's kind of sad, but on the other hand, might work. Who knows? And that's the reason why we have 50 states in the U.S., a giant laboratory of, they call it democracy, but I call it this economic policy. So we'll see if it works. So my take on this is that there won't be a giant, burst of inflation after the current one that we're experiencing, that will kind of plateau in the future. And as a result, bonds, the yields of the bonds will probably remain where they are. They won't go to, the 3% level that they were before COVID. And what that means in effect is a resumption of the growth trade, meaning like SaaS companies, all those high multiple companies will resume their price appreciation. And you'll have value in the difference between value and growth. Growth has, over the last maybe 10 years has outpaced value, but in the last couple of months or this year, value has really taken off and closed that gap pretty much. I don't know if it has closed the gap for the 10 years, but it's definitely
not a 10-year compounding, but over short periods, you could say value's caught up a little bit.
Yeah, and so the question is, will that revert to where it was before? In a low inflation environment, in a largely quantitative easing environment, and with regular growth happening. And so, for me, at least, my thought process here is that it's really hard to create inflation if the entire infrastructure of the economy hasn't been geared towards inflation. So in other countries where inflation is common, all the contracts you have with employees are indexed inflation. And so, a 5% inflation triggers the next year a 5% increase in wages, which increases prices, and then just the machinery of inflation starts to build up.
Self-reinforce.
Right? Yeah, and it's hard that the only way, or not the only way, but very few, the most obvious way to really dampen that inflation is, to rise the interest rates and create lower economic growth, which creates lower pressures for purchasing. The supply chains don't get stressed, and so as a result, all this stuff doesn't happen. But I don't think the Fed is up for that. They want to maximize employment right now. And so as a result, they're just going to leave the rates where they are. But we won't have that cascading effect because a lot of the contracts now are not indexed for inflation. And so as a result, where labor is the biggest component of this economy, you don't have that cascading effect.
So you're not a buyer of wage inflation. You don't think it's coming.
I don't think wage inflation is going to happen more than the $15 per hour is I think set, but I don't think it's going to be 2025 beyond this short period of time where there's like supply chain shortages and unemployment benefits that rival medium income.
All right, so your bet is inflation is transitory. I personally don't have a strong view one way or another. Shout out to my brother who's always sending me inflation hawk stuff. He works in construction and has to buy lumber and pay workers, and he's a big believer in inflation and wants to own gold and real estate and stuff. And he ends up striking a balance, right? I try to tell him and he agrees with me that the bond market does not agree with that view. So it's a tough thing that I think most of the world is trying to figure out what the
I think the problem with the bond market is that we all know that it's being influenced by the Fed.
Of course.
Right. So is it telling the truth, an adjusted truth?
Right. There's a bid in the bond market that is so big and so massive and so perpetual. It's distorted.
Let's push it. Yeah, it's distorting the market. So who knows if the Fed wasn't here involved, maybe we would have rates of 5% or 4%. Who knows? My other topic was monopolies in the U.S. And I think it's going to be short about this, but I think monopolies in the U.S., they exist. We all know that. I think,
name a couple for us.
I mean, they might not be 100% monopolies, but they get close to that. Comcast in certain regions definitely are. Time Warner, Spectrum, like those are regulated entities in the end. I think Google search is a monopoly. I think in social media, you really have Facebook is truly a monopoly there.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of that type of social media, I think it gets a little bit complicated in terms of how you express that monopoly. But I think Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, they're just like 4 or 5 players. They aren't a multitude of players. Right. I think the App Store and the Android Store are monopolies, like together. Right. So oligopolies.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on. I mean, I think Disney is becoming a monopoly
Amazon
content
e-commerce.
provider. Amazon, well, e-commerce, I think it's a little bit more
broader.
Here.
Walmart's made a bunch of strides, and Shopify obviously has their whole narrative of arming the rebels. But Amazon is, when you say monopoly, I think of Amazon.
Yeah. I think Amazon's a tougher one. I think the App Store and the Android Store are like the most evident ones.
The App Store is bonkers how much power they have. Yeah.
And it's just like everybody complains about it. It's like, why do they take 30%? Like 30% is a huge chunk of taxes.
Right.
The problem with the monopoly is that in the last, I would say 30 years, maybe 40 years, they've shifted their view towards something, a simple question: does this hurt the consumer? And so if it does, then we will apply antitrust tools towards it. If it does, if you can't prove that it hurts
does this company's dominance hurt the customer?
Exactly. And in the past, I would say with the Standard Oil, first of all, it was much easier to determine the answer to that question. But also, I think the other question was, does this company have too much power? Power to influence the market? I don't know. There's a different way other people express this, but in my opinion, it's, does this company have too much power to distort markets, to influence governments, state governments? It's very hard to influence the federal government, but you could to really, compete in the power arena against, the association of people, which is the government. So I start to think that we're heading towards that philosophy, back to that philosophy where we don't want companies to have such power over, freedom of expression, over other types of economic benefits, such as I think commerce in essence, like Apple, they just could hinder you from your ability to make money on the App Store. The App Store is the only choice. That's actual power. Is it harming the consumer? It's hard to prove, right? So, but the question is, to me, is it fair for just one company to have all that power? I don't think it's good for innovation in general.
This whole arena is really tough. There's experts in this who only work on this one problem. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the prevailing narrative right now is that antitrust is just not, it's not popular. It's not a popular thing to bring up, or hasn't been over the course of, I don't know, my lifetime, to go, busting up monopolies like they did in the first part of the 20th century. It just hasn't been there hasn't been political appetite, hasn't been popular. And like you said, the prevailing narrative was, well, if the customer's okay, then we're not going to worry about it. But I can see that being, and I've heard many people say that among the biggest risks to the big boys at the top of the market is regulation against that, which is why Facebook, Apple, Amazon spend God knows how much on lobbying, hiring the right people, getting them appointed, and in high
the
offices.
Other part is, okay, so if the solution is not breaking them up, but regulating them, but if regulation becomes a stifle of the competition, that's really bad too.
Totally.
So my opinion has always been like the Microsoft was probably a good way of handling that issue. They just forced them not to buy, or like they pushed them in a way that they couldn't buy up competitors. They couldn't really buy up innovations. That they had to let other players come in. And in another way, that I think that famous investment that Bill Gates did or Microsoft did in Apple really saved Microsoft in itself from more antitrust, because if Apple went down, there wouldn't be any competition. I think there's big issues. I mean, it's very hard to have competing app stores on the iPhone, right? That doesn't make sense. Right. I think one way there is like the biggest problem is like why should platform owners introduce their own competing products in there? I think that's very unfair. It's like alcohol, right? You have to separate the ownership of who is the manufacturer, who is the distributor, and the retailer. I think those are three different businesses, and that you cannot be in all three. You cannot be an integrated player.
Right, so the Apple Podcast app competes with Spotify, functionally. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
And on top of that, Apple takes a huge cut of Spotify's subscription revenue.
Yeah. That's not it can't happen. If you're competing, you have to provide some sort of you can compete in one arena. So if you want to compete in podcasts, then you should not be able to take the 30%. You have to lower it to the cost.
So there is something going on with this now. Facebook and Google are fighting these, right? They've been, CEOs have been dragged into Congress to talk about this within the past couple of years, right? And I recall seeing on Twitter, I'm sure you saw this as well, it was a subpoena or something of old Facebook internal emails, and Mark Zuckerberg was talking about the potential Instagram acquisition, and he said there's only there's like a limited number of human like behavioral biases that we can like harvest and use, right? These habits that people have that we know that we can manipulate, which was like such a sinister and cunning thing that was of course totally correct, and has ended in him having a insane amount of power and Facebook being hugely influential.
I think there was another email which was like, Instagram can hurt us, so we ought to buy them out.
Right,
like
right, yeah.
Sealing their fate in terms of antitrust there.
Totally. My mom, who's a lawyer, taught me very young that if you don't want something read aloud in a courtroom, you shouldn't write it down on your computer.
I think you should only have face-to-face conversations of some things that
over encrypted channels. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have one more topic, which is crypto crash.
Here's the headline: crypto prices down bad
Do you think they'll recover?
to previous all-time highs, meaning, Ethereum at what, $4,000 and Bitcoin at 64,000 or whatever. I do.
Yeah.
I do think that it is in the realm of likelihood that we will see those prices again at some point. How fast? No clue.
My take on this is that if you just look at the graph, you could easily see how the movement from 30 to 60 might have been a little bit of exuberance there. The movement from 20 to 30, from the previous peak to this peak, it happened pretty soon. And that's my fear, right? It's 2017 or 2018 is when it went from like 20. It was at the peak of 20. I thought it would take much longer, but who knows?
You thought it would take much longer after crash from 20 in late 2017? You thought it would take longer to reach that all-time high again?
Yeah. I think that was also an era of emotional exuberance. Maybe the price at that point was 7. 7 was a standard price. That 6, 7.
Mm-hmm.
If you count what has been the inflation from 2018 to 2021, let's say it is like 12%, 10%. That's an extra $1,000 from like a $10,000 level. Even if you take the $20,000 being the peak, it's another 10% there is another $2,000. So maybe there's more interest and more use cases, and as a result, more demand for the currency. And as a result, like, okay, 30,000 is the fair price. I don't think 60,000 was ever a fair price. I don't know. I think though structurally, Ethereum makes way more sense. I'm in Ethereum. If the changes get passed that they're proposing, then you have a currency that's deflating, right? So meaning the availability of Ethereum is decreasing. So the value should increase as a result.
Right. So EIP 1559 and the launch of ETH2, potentially super bullish. I have a take here that just is what it is. I just have an opinion that I don't think I've shared yet. So Mark Cuban, famous investor, rich guy, much more qualified to give tips on investing than I am, even though I'm a professional, got deeply rugged by a project called Titan, which had some, it was in the DeFi ecosystem, had some lend borrow protocol, and had some stablecoin and governance token setup. It was one of these DeFi webs of complexity that I personally have, if I'm being honest, not gotten my head all the way around, except maybe the decentralized exchanges. I think I have a decent idea what's going on with those, but beyond that, DeFi I find really, really hard to get my head around. It came out, so this protocol collapsed. Mark Cuban lost a ton of money. He came out and said, "Oh, there should be regulation of stablecoins and yada yada." But I think he mostly took it. I think he took it well. He was like, "Yeah, I thought this was going to work great, and it didn't work great. I can afford it. It is what it is. Fine, all fine and good." What's not fine and good is the idea that the average investor can look at a DeFi protocol or a token built on Ethereum and actually do due diligence. Unless you are a literal Solidity software developer, you cannot look at these protocols and tell me that you can evaluate the economics of what they're promising that they do to you, which they're going to put together in a marketing document, right? Which will be a white paper, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, it works like this. You're going to lend to this. Here's how we protect you from this." But unless you can actually go and test the code and tell me that it reflects what is in the promises, you don't actually have the ability to do due diligence on that. So the bar is extremely high. It's really, really hard. And there's just a lot of, I think there's still exuberance, honestly, left over in that Ethereum space. I think it's in Ethereum, and I think it's all over the crypto world about how these protocols are going to disintermediate anybody and everybody. And that's great. And the idea that, code will replace institutions and middlemen is good, but you also have to be able to understand the code in order to rely on it.
Of course.
Which is takes a good bit of technical chops that I personally don't have.
Yeah.
If you do, congrats to you. I don't. It seems like Mark Cuban maybe didn't either.